The Best of Our Knowledge explores topics on learning, education, and research. On today's episode, scientists have used artificial intelligence to decode brainwave patterns and reconstruct music, and rock band Pink Floyd is part of the mix. And in an age of increasing political polarization, a new initiative at Bard College aims to develop critical reading and writing skills through its new Center for Ethics and Writing. I'm Lucas Willard, host of The Best of Our Knowledge. You're listening to The Best of Our Knowledge. I'm Lucas Willard. If you're a listener to classic rock radio, you're likely familiar with songs from Pink Floyd's 1979 double album, The Wall. Another Brick in the Wall, the three-part operatic rock song, is certainly an earworm. You know part 2, where the kids don't need no education? Now, a new study has used artificial intelligence to decode brainwave patterns from people who listened to Pink Floyd's Another Brick in the Wall, Part 1.
All in all was just a brick in the wall.
That audio is taken from a study published in scientific journal PLOS Biology. Specifically, a team of scientists has for the first time reconstructed music from patterns from the part of the brain called the human auditory cortex. Listen closely. Though the study and its findings were only recently published, the brainwave patterns reconstructed through AI were initially recorded beginning in 2008 at Albany Medical College. Neurologist Peter Brunner, now a professor at the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis, said the recordings were taken from patients with epilepsy. As part of his research, Brunner and his colleagues wanted to study how the human brain processes auditory information. I asked him why Pink Floyd was chosen as part of the study.
Pink Floyd seemed to be something that's universally loved. It also had some scientific motivations. Of course, it contains lyrics. It contains just periods of silence and periods of music. So it contains all the different aspects that comprise music. So it was a great choice.
Did you play the whole record, or did you just stick with that song?
So initially, we actually played also the second part, but then our focus shifted more and more towards other studies. And since we only have a limited amount of time with these patients, we had to cut down a little bit on the scope of the music project. So we limited it to part 1.
AI is becoming more powerful with programs like ChatGPT able to answer complex questions. Brunner said advancements in technology now make something like reconstructing a popular rock song from brainwave patterns more easily possible.
So what AI is really doing, it's basically taking methods that we have used for 40 to 50 years from a field called machine learning and putting them into a new framework. And this framework just makes it much, much easier to get structure out of signals, so to speak, and put them together.
What do you think some other applications of this could be? Would this maybe help patients recover some memories or recover something that they might have lost as a result of epilepsy or another episode?
Yeah, so there I have to temper a little bit the expectations. So what we are typically interested in is first understanding how the human brain is working. What that means is before we approach therapy, so before we go into, which is sometimes a very expensive endeavor, doing clinical trials, translating these findings into some tangible, therapy, we really want to understand the underlying mechanism. So this is really, using AI to gain a better scientific understanding of where in the brain the processing of music is happening. That being said, there are many conditions, psychiatric conditions and so forth, where your processing of information can be distorted. One thing that springs to my mind is ADHD, for example. essentially you're not perceiving the world the same way as somebody who's more neurotypical is processing it. So this can be potentially a way of better understanding these differences in processing the external world. Something that, given that vastness of information that we can collect from the human brain, we have this three-dimensional structure that's kind of folded, inside of our skull, and we can, only record a very small number of locations at the same time, and yet this yields like this huge amount of data. So AI is really allowing us to process this data in a more efficient way.
So AI is really helping scientists like yourself understand how the brain works. And how much of a step forward is that versus methods 10, 20 years ago for forming a more complete understanding of the human brain?
It's not so far away, because always what we try to do is we try to go back into this original space. So when you think about an AI, what you do is you basically take, like location and time. So location meaning where on the brain, time meaning where relative to a stimulus. You're processing information and put it into some high dimensional space. And in this space, basically AI finds all the patterns. What is very important for us is to be able to project this back into this anatomical space, because that's what we see, that's what's in front of us. So if you want to make medical decisions, if you want to, for example, this is potential application, ensure that particular areas of the brain are spared when patients undergo resective brain surgery, then we need to be able to project this back into this very same space. So previously, we only have worked in this space. We only worked in, we did univariate, that's what this is called, statistics. And this is basically just taking this and putting it in a more high dimensional space, but with always the objective to go back into original space so that we can actually make some neuroscientific inference and learn about how the human brain is working.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And, what do you think of these recordings? How do you think they turned out?
Actually, I was not expecting this. So I'm glad we picked Pink Floyd and not something else.
Peter Brunner is a neurologist and professor at the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis, and part of a team behind the new research article, Music Can Be Reconstructed from Human Auditory Cortex Activity Using Nonlinear Decoding Models, published in PLOS Biology. You are listening to The Best of Our Knowledge. I'm Lucas Willard. In the age of the internet, social media, changes in how people read and consume news, and increasing political polarization, a new academic program at Bard College wants to help make sense of it all. Bard's new Center for Ethics and Writing, now in development, aims to reimagine the study of literature and writing as both an academic and social practice. The goal is to transform students into critical readers and writers, not afraid to dive into divisive social issues and to amplify the work of at-risk artists. The Best of Our Knowledge's Jody Cowan spoke with the director for the Center of Ethics and Writing, Dina Mangetsu, to learn more.
We often teach writing, and even as the humanities deteriorate in the college classroom, the idea of writing still remains quite poignant to students. But we often think of it as this very private creative act. And in doing so, we fail to make the argument for writing as more than just a personal creative act, but as something that can be responsive to the world around us. So part of what we ask our students to do is move away from this understanding of writing as just a purely imaginative craft-based act, and to think of it as a form of engagement. So we write not just because we have our wonderful imaginations, because we've read something that we like, but because we actually want to figure out, how do we tell a story that deals with climate change? How do we tell stories that actually look at the consequences of structural racism? How do we tell stories that talk about the economic degradation of our communities, that talk about addiction, that talk about migration, but to do so in a way in which those stories are more than just a private reaction, right? But that are actually trying to figure out, well, what's been said about them before, and how do I create something that actually is trying to change the conversation around these topics, right? Because what happens in these public discourses is so essential to informing our policies, is so essential to informing the way people in the larger world think about those issues. Creating stories is more than just to create a private act, but also a very public one. And we try to make sure our students can understand that. And we find that when we do so, we dramatically change the type of students who are interested in writing, who are interested in the humanities. It becomes less about an elite kind of privileged discourse and more about something that students from a broad range of socioeconomic, cultural backgrounds find that they can actually engage with.
Unrolling the launch of the center here, what are the plans for, this next, academic year or two?
Well, I mean, one of the biggest things that we're looking forward to doing is our partnership that we have with PEN America, right? One of the arguments that we want to make, again, for the role writing in the humanities can play is that these are fundamental works that can change the way the world actually functions. And one of the ways we want to demonstrate that is by partnering with PEN to work with artists and writers around the world whose work has actually put them at risk. So if you want to understand the value of free expression, if you want to know why it's so important we make room for difficult types of discourse in the classroom, why we don't resort to a type of binary understanding of the world, look at the consequences, right? And let's bring people into the classroom from around the world whose work and lives have come under threat because they've written something that a government didn't like, or that a non-state actor found to be problematic and is now trying to silence them. We want to hear and make sure students understand the consequences for the written work that they might be able to produce is quite profound and has real consequences. And we want to reinstill the significance and the value of that work. And we want to support these writers. We want to support these artists. And we want to do so by bringing their work into the classroom, by bringing their lives into the classroom, by publishing their work alongside of the work of our students. So that's something we're looking forward to launching in the next few months, is having this international cohort of fellows whose work represents really significant attempts to kind of change cultural discourses in the countries they're from, and who have, had to unfortunately pay the price for that.
What kind of defensive tools are you able to employ to students to combat the idea of work being taken down, work being stricken, their personal, lives being at risk from their, sharing their experience?
I mean, it's there's no doubt about the threat that those things, and I don't know if we can insulate them from those threats. I think it's probably wrong to do that. I think more than anything, is we want to expose them and to those challenges and to those threats, and that means exposing them and having them take on subjects not only in which the things that they might write might put them at risk, but things that they don't want to read either, or that things that they might imagine they don't want to read because they find the representation of those ideas problematic. I think one of the things that happens is we oftentimes characterize what students are willing and able to engage with. We think that they're afraid to engage with certain ideas or certain topics. And at the same time, we certainly see in certain places, a real willingness to dismiss whole forms of literature or take books out of the classroom because they've been deemed to be problematic for whatever reasons that are, oftentimes based on the identity of the authors. We can't insulate students from that very real reality. What we can do, though, is I think try to make sure that we ourselves don't reproduce that. And part of what that means is actually, looking at not only those texts that are being taken out of the classroom, but also texts that we ourselves might find to be difficult, that we might find to be challenging, problematic, not because we want students to be exposed to them just for the sake of exposure, but because we also understand that the only way we can create something that doesn't reproduce that bias is to understand where that bias comes from. We have to have a conversation with it. And we also have to show that what happens on the other side of that political discourse, what happens in that real form of silencing that comes with book banning, that comes with taking classes or taking students' libraries away from them, that type of real silencing, is something that we are not participating in. And if anything, what we are trying to do is create a cultural discourse that is actively moving and sort of challenging that position.
What does the current or future landscape of employment look like for writers in this field, or that are taking the time to really kind of hone in on this ethically sourced writing material?
I think it's better than ever. And I think it's part of that idea that we have to make the argument for these things. If we continue to think of the humanities and writing as these very private, sort of elitist ideas, then we continue to run into the same problem, right? Then we continue to see students shifting away from this type of study into what they imagine to be more employable forms of I'm going to do computer science because I can get a job. I come from a family of immigrants. It's very important as a first generation college student to have a form of study that will get me a job. But no one told me that, well, writing and knowing how to write and knowing actually how to engage with a particular text is one of the most employable things that you might be able to have. It's one thing that AI is not going to take away from us. There's no AI system that will be able to actually look at a text, understand the historical biases that text is based on, and then create something new that both engages with and doesn't reproduce that. AI will code for us very soon, right? It'll do a lot of the technology that we imagine to be a secure form of employment will be and can easily be replaced by that. The type of complicated reading and writing that we're teaching our students to do is the very thing that actually can't be stripped away. It's the very thing that I think more and more so will actually be in demand. If you want to understand the ethics of this new technology, you have to know the language. And you have to know how to write in a way that that hopefully moves that technology forward at the same time, right? That actually allows us to perhaps create predictive language models that aren't just reproducing our stereotypes and our biases, which is what is happening now, and which will continue to happen unless we start engaging with it more directly.
I know that the center has goals for the online journal that will be in use this fall. Can you talk to me about your hopes for the journal?
Yeah, I mean, and some of the journal, the idea of the journal is very much related to that, previous question about, well, how do you actually show what the relevance of this work is? And the journal is one way of actually doing, well, here's what happens when you ask students from a diverse group of campuses, right? Students here at Bard Annandale, students who are studying at our community colleges in Harlem, students who are studying at our community college in the Bronx, perhaps students who are studying at one of our campuses in upstate New York. Outside of Annandale, what happens when you bring all of their work that they produce in these very different classes together, and this journal becomes a space for us to be able to witness what that type of critical creative discourse looks like in a very real material way. So what does it mean to actually engage with climate change through writing, and what types of work are created in conversation with that? The only way we'll understand that very particular issue is by creating more and more narratives that engage with it in a fully complicated way, that engage not only with the consequences, but with the origin, with the possible resolution. The journal will hopefully become a space in which these very different types of stories that engage with very different issues are all gathered together, and not only with the work the students produce, but also with our fellows program. And so we imagine the journal as being this kind of public-facing space in which we see the work actually made material, in which we see students, writers, taking on real difficult issues in a way that respects the complexity of those issues, in a language that is nuanced, that's ambiguous, that is ethically complicated.
Have any words of encouragement or advice for just young distressed writers that maybe we haven't gotten to the college level, but we're headed that way, and looking at this ocean of hurdles ahead of us here?
I'd say the most important thing is your voice is needed. I mean, more so now than ever, right? More so, even as we imagine that there are so many different forms of communication and expression possible, we see enough of a very degraded type of discourse already, right? We see it on social media, we see it oftentimes in the news. More so than ever, we need people to actually step into those public spaces, into the private spaces with a type of language, with a type of discourse that doesn't reproduce that actually comes back and wants to make an argument forcefully and eloquently for a more complicated and nuanced way of seeing the world. So now more than ever, I think we need that type of engagement. We need those writers.
Anything else that I missed or anything else that you would like to mention?
I have to say that this center wouldn't be possible without the very, encouraging support of our different partners, our faculty at the micro colleges, my partners at Penn America. So it really is a kind of consortium of people and community organizations working together to make it happen.
Dina Mengetsu is director of the Center for Ethics and Writing at Bard College. He spoke with the Best of Our Knowledge's Jody Cowan. At a time where some localities and school districts are seeking to place more restrictions on what kinds of reading materials students can access, a group of state lawmakers in Massachusetts is looking to protect public libraries from attempts to ban books. The Best of Our Knowledge's Paul Tuthill reports.
In response to a rise in attempts by conservative groups and parents to remove materials from library shelves, a group of Democratic legislators are proposing to effectively blunt book bans by putting up new requirements for libraries to receive state funds. State Senator Jake Oliveira of Ludlow and State Representative Aaron Saunders of Belchertown have filed identical legislation in their respective chambers. Oliveira said they hope to block the national book banning movement before it can take hold in Massachusetts.
This is all an attempt to censor material in our public libraries, in our schools, focusing in on certain populations, and it's based in a right-wing ideology. It's not based in fact. It is based in xenophobia, and we're not going to stand for that here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
The bill would require that in order to be eligible for state grant funding, libraries would have to adopt the American Library Association's Library Bill of Rights, which states in part, quote, materials should not be excluded because of the origin, background, or views of those contributing to their creation. The Library Association reports that attempts to censor books reached a 20-year high in 2022, with twice as many attempts as the year before. A survey in June of more than 100 libraries in the state by the Massachusetts Library Association found at least 78 challenges to books so far this year, up from 20 all of last year.
These upticks that we've seen in these book challenges at the local level within our public libraries, but also in our public schools, are something that's targeting certain communities.
What spurred the two Western Massachusetts legislators to act was a proposal before the Ludlow School Committee earlier this year that would have removed several titles from the school's libraries. It ultimately failed without a vote. The sponsor admitted the proposal had been copied directly off the internet.
Obviously, coming from Ludlow, having served 12 years on the Ludlow School Committee, seeing policies that are proposed by school committee members that are just grabbed from the internet without being vetted by attorneys, that are focusing in on communities of color and the LGBTQ plus community is unconscionable to me.
The legislation is before the Joint Committee on Municipalities and Regional Government, where Saunders said they hope to get a hearing on it this fall.
We are obligated to take steps to protect these freedoms in these materials from being banned for what amounts to a political objective.
He said they are seeking co-sponsors for the legislation.
Part of our job, Senator Oliveira, my job, is to have those conversations with colleagues, to educate them about, first, the issue, which doesn't take a whole lot of education because it seems like folks are seeing it all over, but also why this piece of legislation is effective in protecting those freedoms.
Separately, a bill filed by State Senator Julian Sear addresses school libraries. It establishes standards for the removal of books by a school committee vote. It would allow challenges to the removals to be made in court.
The Best of Our Knowledge's Paul Tuthill reporting. You're listening to The Best of Our Knowledge. I'm Lucas Willard. A museum and science center in New York is repatriating indigenous remains that had been part of its collection. WXXI's Noel Evans takes us to the ceremony in Rochester where Oneida Nation representatives reclaimed human remains and museum officials apologized for contributing to a practice that dehumanizes Native Americans.
We're in the Cunningham House outside the Rochester Museum and Science Center. Draped over a table at the front of the room is a wool blanket depicting the clans and nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. On it rests 19 tiny leather pouches. These are medicine bags. Oneida Representative Ray Holbritter says each one represents a person whose remains will be properly buried after having been exhumed and put on display.
These bags are traditionally made when preparing for a significant journey. These bags will accompany our ancestors on a final journey as their remains will be returned to our homelands until the end of time. That's where they will rest.
Holbritter has just finished signing an official document transferring the remains and artifacts to the Oneida Indian Nation through the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. The law was first enacted in 1990.
I want to acknowledge that this repatriation should have occurred a long time ago, and to recognize that the ancestors and their belongings should never have been at the RMSC in the first place.
That's the museum's CEO, Hillary Olson. She says the organization has shifted priorities the past 2 years to focus on repatriating indigenous remains and artifacts. According to a report by ProPublica earlier this year, RMSC has the 21st largest collection of unrepatriated indigenous remains in the United States. Catherine Morano-Santos with the museum says that's already changing.
We know that there's a lot more work to be done, and in fact, we are working in concert with the tribes and nations now, following their lead and moving forward with their priorities to complete our repatriation work.
Santos says RMSC is working with about 20 tribes and nations across New York State on those efforts. The Oneida have been among them. Ray Holbritter says this ceremony to return the remains of Oneida people to their homeland bears great significance, especially at a time when there are still over 100,000 unrepatriated Native American remains at museums and institutions across the country.
Above all, it must be understood that every minute the remains of our ancestors and our cultural artifacts are not returned continues this shameful legacy of abuse inflicted upon Native peoples.
WXXI's Noel Evans reporting. This has been The Best of Our Knowledge, episode 1719. The Best of Our Knowledge is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio. Thanks to associate producer Jody Cowan. The latest on all National Productions programs is available via the Airwaves newsletter and our flagship station's website, WAMC.org. Until next time, I'm Lucas Willard.